The Resident Evil IP is arguably Capcom's commercially strongest brand. Starting out as a tanky survival horror franchise on the PlayStation, it has evolved into many follow-up titles since the first game, while maintaining its own themes. Besides the numbered titles, the series is host to a handful of spin-offs, including such games as Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City and Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles. In this video, we'll discuss Resident Evil Outbreak, a game that illustrates Capcom's difficulty in creating a vision for cooperative Resident Evil and a more than a decade earlier precursor to Project Resistance. To introduce the game, Outbreak is a title that is notable in that it was first to introduce online multiplayer and cooperative gameplay to the Resident Evil franchise, though online play was ultimately never realized for Europe and Australia due to difficulty Capcom encountered in accommodating many different languages and the need to collaborate with different ISPs. The origins of this game actually goes as far back as prior to the release of Resident Evil 2. Outbreak, along with Automodelista and the first ever Monster Hunter, was part of a set of titles meant to take advantage of the potential of the PlayStation 2, particularly with regards to utilizing its online gaming capabilities. Capcom had hoped that one of the three would be million sellers, and eventually that distinction would apply to both Outbreak and Monster Hunter. Noritaka Funamizu, who drafted an idea for a multiplayer game wherein players would survive a zombie horde for as long as possible. But this idea was ultimately scrapped since the concept would encourage players to run away and protect themselves rather than work cooperatively. Further bolstering the decision to scrap this game was the idea that Resident Evil's sense of horror was enhanced by the feeling of being alone. After initially being shuttered, development for Resident Evil Outbreak resumed again a couple of years later with the information and drafting gleaned from first working on Outbreak years ago, with an official unveiling at a Sony press conference in February of 2002. Control-wise, it plays the same as the earliest Resident Evil games. You choose between one of 5 different scenarios to play through, one of a handful of playable characters, at a difficulty level for your scenario. Each scenario also has a list of objectives that players can complete to achieve 100% completion, along with unlockables that can be acquired per playable character, including the ability to listen to recorded voice lines for characters. Online play for Resident Evil Outbreak would forego voice chat in favor of pre-recorded character lines, as Capcom had thought that voice chat would ruin the atmosphere intended for the game. Messages that players wanted to communicate to each other would have to follow what was already available to them from the selection of voice recordings. By the time of October of 2002, 18 different scenario missions, as opposed to the final release's 5, were in development, along with what would be the final total of 8 playable characters. By May of 2003, the game would adopt its final title of Resident Evil Outbreak, initially known as Biohazard Online in Japan, with Biohazard being the franchise name in that country. Outbreak would ultimately release to middling reception on the whole, seen mostly as a serviceable game and not much else, while the failure to deliver on network capabilities for European and Australian gamers was seen as a disappointment. The lack of voice chat functionality, seen as important to compete against other prominent online co-op games, was criticized. While voice chat can ruin the heavy horror atmosphere that Capcom wanted, it also is the best facilitator for communication between game players. Nonetheless, it was an interesting foray into online gaming that was also arcadey in nature. Though the game's final package only saw the inclusion of 5 of the initially developed scenario missions, Capcom would later release Resident Evil Outbreak File No. 2, which contained 5 more scenarios to play through. File No. 2 is a standalone expansion that was developed and released on the merit of the sales of the first game. Despite the first game not releasing with online play functionality for Europe, File No. 2 would release for Japan, North America, and Europe. It featured a variety of gameplay improvements, including the ability to move while shooting and the ability to pick up items while crawling, while also introducing some character-specific abilities in a new Nightmare difficulty mode. Network play also saw some changes to the lobby system. Ultimately, File No. 2 significantly underperformed commercially compared to the first release, and the critical reception was worse than the first Outbreak title, still being seen as decent but not much else. There was enough leftover scenario content for a third Outbreak game, but those plans were abandoned, though it has been unearthed that 4-player split-screen co-op was planned even as far back as the first iteration of Outbreak. While servers have been shut down for both the original release and File No. 2, fans have since continued to maintain their own servers for File No. 2, with the fan effort hosting their own forums. Resident Evil Outbreak is important in that core aspects of the game's concept resembles what we see now in Project Resistance. Cooperative gameplay that features newer, regular citizen characters as opposed to series stars such as Jill Valentine. We're more than a decade ahead of File No. 2's release, and the Capcom of today features much different staff than the Capcom during the time of Outbreak's release, to say nothing of the drastically changed state of Resident Evil now, which is a commercial behemoth that also plays much differently compared to Outbreak's first release. Meanwhile, Outbreak enjoys a modest following among fans years following its release, for the attention of detail and fun factor found in the game's scenario missions. While failing to make much of an impact on the broader gaming populace, the Outbreak titles can be seen as ahead of their time, held back by some game design decisions, and the uneven server functionality across regions marked Capcom's earliest efforts in dealing with managing and creating online servers for their games. Were you able to play either Outbreak or File No. 2 when they first released? What do you think of Project Resistance now that promotional media of the game has since made the rounds? What sounds more preferable to you, Project Resistance or Outbreak? Though it should be stated that Resistance is a 4v1 game, and these are two distinct visions for cooperative Resident Evil play. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.